stands for the Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committees. So the mandate of the local HSJCs is to engage in joint cross-sectoral planning, coordination, and integration of services for individuals living with a mental illness who are also involved or at significant risk of being involved with the criminal justice system. There are 4 local HSJCs, one in West Toronto, North York, downtown Toronto, and Scarborough. They all report to the Toronto Regional Committee. The 4 local HSJCs identify local priorities for planning coordinated services, and they establish a process for planning and joint problem solving in relation to these local priorities. Each local HSJCC is responsible for working together to address local needs and reporting to the Toronto Regional HSJCC to help inform systems planning at a regional level. If you're interested in joining the committee, please respond in the chat box here with your email, and the coordinator, Dominica, will contact you. Please make sure that you mute yourself and turn your video off. If you have any questions, please write it in the chat box. There's going to be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, so we'll be looking through the chat box at that time. This session is going to be recorded and uploaded to the provincial HSJCC website under the North York HSJCC resource section. We're also asking you to please complete an evaluation. The link is going to be put in the chat box. Your feedback will just help us plan for future sessions that will assist us with continually improving these lunch and learns that we provide. It only takes about a minute to complete and needs to be done once you leave the session. So any time that you can allocate to that would greatly be appreciated. For today's presentation, we are lucky enough to have the BLAC Legal Action Center. We have 2 presenters. I'm going to go through their bios here. So Sade Makinde is a community legal worker at the BLAC Legal Action Center. She studied law and legal studies, as well as communications at Carleton University. She's committed to furthering her goal of curtailing systemic discrimination for marginalized populations, specifically anti-Black individual and systemic discrimination, through awareness and advocacy. Throughout her career, as well as in her spare time, she loves to participate and educate herself on matters pertaining to equity and human rights. Working at the BLAC Legal Action Center fulfills Sade's combined passion of working with and within her community to develop access to justice and combat systemic anti-Black racism. And another presenter is Halda Saleh. In her bio here, she's also a community legal worker. She works to ensure members of the Black community across Ontario have access to the BLAC Legal Action Center services and to legal information related to anti-Black racism. She facilitates the community outreach and partnerships, conducts public legal education sessions, and coordinates the BLAC Legal Action Center's communications. She's motivated to combat anti-Black racism within Ontario and across borders while centering the experiences and the needs of the Black communities. As an independent researcher, she's explored issues of surveillance and state violence as related to activism. She's worked in several humanitarian and developmental organizations in Sudan, Khartoum, sorry, I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, including as a protection assistant at the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, where she was a caseworker with refugees and asylum seekers. Most recently, she was a project coordinator at the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, working on housing rights policy and coordinating with youth program. She also has a bachelor's degree from McGill University in political science and international development, and a master's degree from the University of British Columbia in gender, race, sexuality, and social justice. So thank you very much for both of you being here, and we're very excited to listen to the presentation upcoming. And I should go over the learning objectives. So we have a few learning objectives for the view of this presentation. So one being, what is anti-Black racism and how does anti-Black racism manifest? How can the BLAC Legal Action Center help, and what are their services? In terms of addressing anti-BLAC racism, when should you refer clients to the BLAC Legal Action Center? And the final objective would be anti-BLAC racism in the time of COVID-19 and beyond. Can we identify concrete ways to address anti-BLAC racism in our work? Thank you very much. I'll let the presenters take forward now.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. We're very excited to be here. We're excited to get into this discussion. So my name is Sade Makinde. As you already introduced me, I'm a community legal worker here with the BLAC Legal Action Center.
Hi, my name is Carleton University. I'm a community legal worker at BLAC as well.
Okay, so we're going to start with the land acknowledgement. So the land we are speaking to you from today is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and right now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This land is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We also recognize the history of this land as a site of oppression of Black people and the relation between a history of enslavement and settler colonialism. It's important to frame this conversation through that lens so we recognize our position in relation to this land. All right, so we're going to start. So for the overview of this presentation, we're going to give you a little bit of information about the BLAC Legal Action Center, what we can do if you want to refer your clients to us or the people that you work with to us, exactly what we do. We're going to discuss some anti-BLAC racism terminology, and then I'm going to give you a brief look at the history of Canada in terms of a perspective from a Black Canadian. We're going to talk a bit about manifestations of racism, systemic racism actually within society. And then we're going to talk a bit about data collection and the importance of disaggregated data and race-based data collection. And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please hold on to them to the end so we can just get more in depth. So as we've already gone over the learning objectives for today's conversation. So we're going to talk about what is anti-Black racism specifically, how it manifests, and ways we can, concrete ways we can address it within our work. So the BLAC Legal Action Center is a community legal clinic. We are working to combat individual and systemic anti-Black racism here in Ontario. So we work directly with Black people experiencing anti-Black racism, and we also conduct policy reform and public legal education, such as this, to combat it at a systemic level. So we only provide services if the legal issue is related to anti-Black racism, but we will refer you if you do not fall, or whoever is being referred to us, we will refer them as best we can. So we are funded by Legal Aid Ontario. So we're a specialty legal clinic, which means we offer hybrid services. So we deliver legal aid services to low and no income Black Ontarians. So in more detail, we actually worked to combat individual and systemic anti-Black racism by providing legal representation, summary legal advice, brief services to individual clients. We engage in test litigation. We do law reform, community development to improve the laws that affect low-income people. We also, as I mentioned, we give public legal information sessions such as this to members of the public as well as other community organizations. So we can help your clients or referrals by giving them legal advice, as I mentioned, providing practical tools such as checklists, fillable forms, so we can help them fill out forms, fill out police complaints, for example, we'll help with that. We also have some self-help guides. We've got some resources on our website. As I mentioned, we can represent at tribunals and courts. And also, if we can't help you specifically with, if the issue is not related to anti-Black racism specifically, we will refer someone to another agency if we can't help. So all services are free for those who qualify, and we do have a provincial mandate, as I mentioned, so we work within Ontario only. Now we opened our doors in March of 2019. and we are building on the work of others in our community. So because we are relatively new, we are working on in collaboration with the advocates in our community and organizations with a similar mandate. So our vision is a society where anti-Black racism is named and meaningfully addressed, where the humanity and dignity of Black people are centered, where the laws and the legal system are reflective of the real experiences of Black people, and where racial equity and full participation of all Black people in society is achieved. Now, the areas of law that we work in, they're listed on the screen here. So we can help clients who call us about employment law, housing law, human rights, education, prison law, social assistance, so income like ODSP, Ontario Works, police complaints, as I mentioned. Now, we don't currently work within family law or criminal law, and we are in the process of implementing services for immigration and refugee law, so that's coming soon. So in terms of our intake process, as I mentioned, we are a Legal Aid Ontario clinic. So we operate as those clinics do. So because we serve low to no income, there is actually a financial eligibility requirement. So we're going to ask whoever questions about the size of their household to determine if they're eligible, if they meet the requirements for income. And another thing we do mention is if there is a interpreter or some sort of community support member that this person would like to contact us through, that is definitely welcome. So we thought it would be important to give a little bit of information on the demographics, just to frame the coming discussion. So about 600,000 African Canadians, or the Black community in Ontario. So there's about 620,000. 1/3 of those people live in Toronto, here in Ontario. 25% is aged 14 or under, versus 16% of the provincial population otherwise. And 53% are born outside the country. So as you can see, the majority of the Black community here in Ontario is actually born outside the country. So that's something to keep in mind in your work, I guess. And there's a high number of Black population that falls within the youth category. So that's also something to keep in mind. All right, so now we're going to get into a bit of language and terminology, and Khada's going to come in and get us started.
Thank you, Sade. So as we've already mentioned, our clinic specifically works in combating anti-Black racism. And the way that we define this is policies and practices embedded within Canadian institutions that reflect and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination that is directed at people of African descent and is rooted in the unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization in Canada. And this term was first expressed by Dr. Akua Benjamin, Ryerson social work professor, and it seeks to highlight the unique nature of systemic racism on Black Canadians and the history as well as experiences of slavery, colonization of people of Black African descent in Canada.
So interpersonal racism can actually be defined as racism expressed between people, so assaults on dignity, on social status, racial slurs, verbal or physical assaults, individual discriminatory behavior. So microaggressions are actually subtle slights, intentional or not, including statements, actions, minimizations, and invalidations, serving to trivialize one's gendered, racialized, or otherwise, or other identity-based experience by those who do not share those same experiences, thus denying their significance. Now, microaggression is it's an aspect of systemic racism. So it's really just when someone makes a comment that implies or makes the assumption that they are inherently superior to the person they're making the comment against. So it's very often unconsciously made remarks, and it might masquerade as something positive when in reality, it's an insult to that person's racialized identity, right? So examples can include, "You're so articulate," "I did not think you would do so well," things like, "You're surprisingly smart," or "You're pretty for a Black girl." So I just really wanted to reiterate that experiencing microaggressions can actually cause trauma that accumulates over time, because it's really a constant reminder that that person is deemed of lesser value in society. And it can cause tremendous strain and can interfere with mental health. Can also be internalized by youth and children who don't really fully understand yet what's going on in our society.
And very much related to all these issues of systemic racism, obviously, is oppression. So oppression is discrimination backed up by systemic or structural power, sometimes referred to as institutionalized power, including government, education, legal and health system, policies and practices. And oppression in the legal system, in particular, means that instead of asking why a person has come into contact with the criminal in justice system, the system blames individuals for their lot in life instead of taking responsibility for how society has failed that individual. Obviously, we're speaking to all of you, you folks work in community, you work with a lot of clients who are facing a lot of these issues, especially as related to the criminal justice system. And so a lot of these concepts are not new, but what we're really asking is to look at this from, like a cohesive perspective. Part of why we're doing this presentation is also to present all these ideas and ask everybody that they ensure that these concepts and these issues are like the front of their mind as they're doing this work. A lot of us already know the impact of oppression, how it manifests, what it looks like in different forms, how it impacts people in the criminal justice system or in other aspects of their lives. But how we can incorporate that understanding into the work that we do to ensure that we're giving our clients the best possible services, and providing them with the best possible interventions, services, information, and so on, is what we really all need to work on.
I think you're muted. Let's.
Sade, I think you are on mute.
Could you unmute yourself?
Oh, I think maybe.
Sorry about that.
The slides.
Yeah, is that automatic? Because I didn't do that.
No, I'm not even doing that. Sorry.
No,
I'm not
okay.
doing that.
I might have to jump out of the slides and unmute myself if that happens again. Sorry about that. Okay, so I was talking about privilege. So this is an unfair advantage given to some people, but not others, based on their identity or position in society. So it is inherent in our social structures, in the way that society is organized and how it functions. So it's not equally distributed. So power comes from being in a dominant group and is relative to circumstance and context. So power relations are central to shaping how resources are made available.
And white supremacy, which is really at the root of a lot of these concepts, is a political, economic, cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Another aspect is also the invisibility of white supremacy. So in this quote, while the system of white supremacy has shaped Western political thought for hundreds of years, it is not named nor identified as a system at all. In this way, white supremacy is rendered invisible, while other political systems are identified as studied. Much of its power is drawn from its invisibility. And truly, white supremacy as a structure is really so embedded in, for example, the criminal justice system. It's embedded in a lot of aspects of our daily lives and our social settings. So issues of poverty are directly linked to white supremacy, issues of, potentially health, employment, housing, all these things. It's just a part of the system. And we really have to understand that it's an aspect of the system that is so embedded within it to the point that it's invisible. And so it does make it difficult to identify it and find ways to address it, but we really have to come from the perspective of understanding that this is at the root cause of a lot of issues of oppression that people face, that specific communities face, and we have to move forward with that knowledge and centering that fact.
And the sound is a bit hard, like there's it's breaking at some point. I'm just wondering, maybe if you turn your video off, that might help with the sound.
Okay, I just turned my video off.
Here, I'll turn mine off as well. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. Yes, and just to add to what Hada was saying, also the fact that we are born into this system renders white supremacy and just a lot of the systemic discrimination invisible as well. So intersectionality is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. So it's an approach to analyze and understand systems of oppression and power relations. So it's really the idea that inequities are not the result of one single distinct factor, but rather intersecting social positions, for example, race, gender, class, religion, and how it all intersects. So it's the notion that multiple forms of inequality for the disadvantaged sometimes converge and compound themselves to create obstacles and even more extreme barriers. So really, when we're thinking about intersectionality, we want to commit ourselves to understanding that there are many aspects to one person's identity that converge. So it's very multifaceted. So to understand the complex histories that each person that you work with comes to you at that moment in time with, it's really important to understand that there are many combining factors that have led them to where they are. So it really is your duty to be responsive to the community out of which your clients and those you work with come, especially when disadvantaged, facing societal barriers. So say someone has a past criminal record, the key is using the right mindset in each situation. So that's just an example, like say someone has a past criminal record. It's not that they necessarily deserve a harsher sentence and punishment. We don't know what the intersecting factors are that have come to play and have led them on the path that they are on. So people do make mistakes, especially when they have no guidance and support within society. So it's more likely a larger problem of discrimination and barriers within the system, perhaps, right? That has led a person to resort to these illegal activities to get by. So it's just the fact that these people, some of them have been placed in bad situations because the system has failed to help them, or in some cases, the system has even been against them. So if you have any thoughts, I guess we're going to keep the thoughts to the end of the presentation, but do feel free to also write in the chat if there's something that you want to discuss. So now we're going to take a brief look at the history of anti-Black racism within Canada. So we're sure you guys already know this. I guess it's important as not only humans, but not only Canadians, but as human beings, it's important to remember our history, explore the details of what was done in the past, just in order to learn from our mistakes and improve the future. So slavery in Canada began in 1628. There was an enslaved boy who was brought from Madagascar and sold to someone in Montreal. So although slavery was abolished in 1833, and that act went into force August 1st, 1834, as we know, enslaved people legally did get their freedom, but this did not really translate to freedom in reality in terms of here in Canada. So at the time, white men were in control of all aspects of Canadian society. And it was a lot more convenient for them to create a social order based on white supremacy and Black inferiority. So Black people were segregated. There were severe barriers to access to resources for the Black community at the time. The same logic perpetuated during slavery, that Black people were subhuman, commodities, chattel. And that same logic remained in the post-slavery period. So unfortunately, the Black community in Canada didn't gain much power in terms of economic, social, and political, as well as in the post-slavery period. So they did remain in a subservient position. And to this day, Canada carries the impact of slavery and this legacy. So I do want to talk a little bit about the systemic racism that was actually written in. And I'm sure, I'm sure you guys all know about this. This is something that we just know here in Canada. So there was actually sort of an effective immigration ban, and this was written into the Canadian legislation. So Section 38 of the Immigration Act of 1910 stated the governor and council may, by proclamation or order whenever he deems it necessary or expedient, prohibit for a stated period or permanently the landing in Canada or the landing at any specified port of entry in Canada of immigrants belonging to any race deemed unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada, or of immigrants of any specified class, occupation, or character. Now, this is one example that we use frequently here at the Black Legal Action Center, because it's just an example of how systemic racism manifested after slavery and how it was actually written into, like, there's the policy. So So there are a lot of aspects of our legal system now, although it doesn't explicitly target Black people or doesn't explicitly say, it's not explicitly like a racist statute, it's not written in a racist manner. It does still target the Black population in a way that is discriminatory. As you can see, this policy here, they were trying to say that a race deemed unsuited to the climate. And as we know now, that doesn't really make much sense, right? So.
And many aspects of, I was just going to add, Sade, many aspects of anti-Black racism right now that are kind of so embedded within systems. A lot of it doesn't only have to do with explicitly excluding the Black communities from specific services or rights, but rather the lack of addressing anti-Black racism is in itself perpetuating anti-Black racism. And we see that in a lot of aspects of the criminal justice system, for example, or other places where Black people need services or accommodation. The lack of addressing of anti-Black racism in itself perpetuates that system forward.
Yes, thank you so much. Exactly. So all in all, slavery was practiced for 200 years in Canada, and the last segregated school was closed less than 40 years ago. And the United Nations Human Rights Office has stated that racial stereotyping and negative characteristics of people of African descent, which were created to justify the enslavement of Africans, continue to harm people and violate their human rights. So systemic racism is more than the conscious acts of overly bigoted individuals. It is the enduring but often unrecognized structural and psychological legacy of state-sponsored and financially motivated subordination and marginalization of the Black community. So the courts in Ontario have also established that anti-Black racism is deeply embedded in our Canadian institutions, as I'm sure you guys know, in our policies and practices, to the point that it has become part of our systems, stating that racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, is part of our community's psyche. So now we're going to talk a little bit about anti-Black racism within systems today, so how it's manifesting today within our systems.
And there's many manifestations of this. So for example, as specifically as related to the criminal justice system, we see this a lot in policing. So in the practice of racial profiling, where Black people are in particular targeted by police, and also where there's issues of over policing as well as under policing. So thinking specifically about over policing, where specific communities or Black individuals are over surveilled, and there's an increased presence of the police in those communities or among those areas as compared to white counterparts, and also under policing, where we see a lot of Black community are not receiving the security and protection that is supposedly the purpose of police when they are in need of that protection and services. We also see examples of it in the bail system. So for example, the over-reliance on sureties. We also see it in sentencing, as we mentioned before. The lack of recognition of anti-Black racism at sentencing is in itself perpetuating issues of anti-Black racism and continuing that systemic racism. And leading also to the overrepresentation of Black communities within prisons, for example. We see it in the immigration system, which also, as Sade mentioned, has a really long history, especially in Canada, of excluding Black communities, and that continues until now of harsher, I guess, needs and stuff like that for immigrants from the Black community, from African countries or from Caribbean countries, and continuing issues of status and so on, as well as issues for migrant workers, which face a lot of racism when they are in Canada. We also see it in prison conditions. We see it in the child welfare system and high rates of apprehension, in the education system, and particularly in the over-disciplining of Black children because they are seen from a young age to be criminalized. And how that leads also to the school to prison pipeline, which again is directly linked to criminal justice issues that we mentioned, and the lack of police accountability in general. So in issues in particular where the police has used excessive use of force, for example, or led potentially to the killing of Black individuals, there's a huge lack of police accountability. And I think more and more so, we're seeing so many examples of this. So the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent had a visit to Canada in 2016 to kind of address and look into issues of anti-Black racism in Canada. If you can just go to the next slide. Yes, thanks. And this is a quotation from their report. So despite the reputation for promoting multiculturalism and diversity and the positive measures taken by the national and provincial governments referred to above, the working group is deeply concerned by the structural racism that lies at the core of many Canadian institutions and the systemic anti-Black racism that continues to have a negative impact on the human rights situation of African Canadians. So again, from an international human rights perspective, there is a lot to say about Canadian institutions and the lives of Black community within these institutions, and where white supremacy and anti-Black racism are really at the core of it, to the point of impacting people's human rights. In addition, the Ontario Human Rights Commission report from 2018 also points to specifically racial profiling, racial discrimination, the Toronto police. So this is a stat that I think has been widely shared now, so folks know that a Black person in Toronto is nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto Police Service. And if you just look up, arrest Toronto, for example, this is the Google image search. So again, visuals of criminalized Black people, especially young Black men. This is kind of the image of what a criminal is in Toronto, the image of who gets arrested, and it's really directly linked to the over-policing, over-surveillance of these communities.
Thank you for that. So now we're going to talk a little bit in depth. So the child welfare system, so it's extremely disproportionate. So there's a disproportionate rate of child apprehension, especially here in Toronto, where these statistics were taken from the Toronto Children Aid Society in 2016. So 40.8% of all children in care, yet at the time, the Toronto population, the Black community was only 8.5% of the population. So in terms of the education system, there's articles that I get nightmares how racial violence in high schools is taking mental toll on students. So it's just really difficult trying to navigate the system as a youth. So if we're looking at statistics here, we have stats from the Toronto District School Board, because they're actually one of the only school boards to our knowledge that are actually taking race-based statistics. So this is all we have to go off of right now. And we are going to touch a little bit more on collecting data later, but just to reiterate how important it is so that, this kind of discrimination doesn't get swept under the rug, and we have actual concrete data to back it up. So the stats that we have from the TDSB is that 11% of students self-identified as Black, whereas 34% of all students expelled were Black. So that's extremely disproportionate. We actually get some calls about anti-Black racism from parents calling on behalf of their children. They don't know what to do. A lot of them talk about what's listed, which was also listed in the OHRC report titled Ontario Safe Schools Act, School Discipline and Discrimination. So a lot of people talk about teacher treatment, school suspension practices are more harsh compared to their white counterpart. Use of police by school authorities. So the police will treat them a lot worse than someone who's of a different race or who's white. So yeah.
And I know someone in the chat just wrote that there's difficulty hearing. We turned off our videos. I'm not really sure if there's anything else we can do to improve the voice quality. Maybe it'll just get better, hopefully. So we are sorry about that. And as mentioned, we will be including the slides so people will be able to take a look if you're having some trouble hearing right now. Okay, so there's also overrepresentation of Black people in terms of poverty. So looking at statistics, 23%, this is according to the Toronto Vital Signs report from last year. In Toronto, 23% of white Canadians indicated that the pandemic had a strong or moderate impact on their ability to meet their financial obligations or essential needs, compared to 39% of Black Canadians. So again, disproportionate rates in terms of the impact of poverty. And in Ontario, 24.1% of Black people are low income compared to 11.5% of non-racialized people. So these issues are really linked to issues of precarious employment, discrimination in the hiring process and in work. So we hear from a lot of folks who have had issues of discrimination in the workplace, who want to take action, specifically, filing human rights complaints and stuff. We hear from people who've been so impacted by this to the point that they are on stress leave. And yeah, this really impacts people's ability to kind of move out of poverty, obviously, but also that there's, we obviously understand that poverty itself is cyclical. And so it's extremely difficult for someone who is in poverty to be able to get out of poverty. And this impacts in particular the Black community a lot. And also in thinking of health, in terms of COVID-19, as an example, 21% of reported COVID-19 cases affected Black people, who make up only 9% of the city's overall population. It's obviously directly linked to issues of employment as well. So a lot of frontline workers or essential workers as well are of the Black population. And health inequities are not only about these numerical differences, but they're also in the unjust differences and the systems that are perpetuated at the healthcare level. So we also hear from people who've experienced issues accessing services in hospitals, issues accessing issues in being heard by their doctors, by their nurses, and this can really impact their health outcomes and have a very negative impact on their lives.
So in terms of housing, the stats we have from 2016 are that 20.6% of Black Canadians reported living in housing below standard, which means that their housing costs more than they can afford and or is crowded and or requires major repairs. So 7.7% of white Canadians reported living in housing below standard. So as you can see, that's extremely disproportionate considering the percentage of Black Canadians.
So we really have to keep in mind, obviously, that social and economic systems, in issues of education, health, employment, community, housing, criminal justice are all extremely linked together, all contribute to a person's experiences, the power dynamics that they have to live through, and even their interactions with the criminal justice system. And also thinking, we talked about health as well, but also thinking about mental health issues, the relationship also between, mental health and policing, how people come into contact with the criminal justice system, how people come into contact with, with police as well, if they're in mental health crises. And certainly I think a lot of you folks have an understanding and experience in this. So yeah, keeping in mind all of these issues and how they're all related to each other and can impact the individuals. Okay, so we also have to recognize that people of color can also be perpetuating anti-Black racism. When we think about white supremacy, we also have to consider that white supremacy has created, has made itself so that, people are differentiated from each other and that there are specific communities that have a closer proximity to whiteness, perhaps. And so because of power and privilege, oppression is not equitably distributed against communities of color, and anti-Black racism is a very distinct form of racism. It's not general racism, and that's why we start with that definition, because Black people have had a very specific and unique history globally and also within Canada. And so, as an example, people of color, the term cannot necessarily be used interchangeably with Black. We also have to examine anti-Black racism and pro-whiteness within the communities of people of color, within cultures and upbringings. A lot of people that there's a lot of anti-Black racism that is really normalized within a lot of cultures and communities. including those of people of color. And so that really has to be addressed. And acknowledging that, people of color are often very complicit in the oppression of Black people. And thinking about cities like Toronto, for example, which has such, large racialized populations, this is really, really critical. And so people have to be really aware of their own fragilities when it comes to speaking of this, because if you're a racialized individual that experiences systemic racism, it might also be a difficult thing to recognize that you could be perpetuating anti-Black racism yourself, or be a part of a community that is perpetuating anti-Black racism. And that can be a very difficult thing, but people have to be really aware of their own fragilities and understand that, ending anti-Black racism helps us all. It is really, solidarity in that aspect is really important. So the impact of anti-Black racism can be extreme. So there's the psychological and emotional pain of incidents is passed on to families, friends, and larger social groups and across generations. Microaggressions and instances of racism that a person experiences can cause psychological stress and behavioral stress. And the added stress of having to deal with those issues of racism is also really impacts an individual's stress. So I mentioned earlier that we hear from a lot of people who experience discrimination in the workplace, for example. By the time they've contacted us, they're already on stress leave because of the toll that has had on them. And it's really important to, when thinking about racism and systemic racism, to center the impact more than centering the intent. So it's not about whether or not the individual who was perpetuating that racism intended to do it, but rather centering the individual who experienced it, the impact that had, and the impact in various areas of their lives, not just in the emotional pain or whatever, but how it could have impacted other aspects of their lives, how it can impact all those different manifestations of anti-Black racism that we were talking about right now, how it could potentially impact their employment, how it could potentially impact their access to health services, their access to mental health services, their ability to access those services. A lot of people also experience so much anti-Black racism when they are going into trying to access community and social services, right? And the impact of that, what it means for people to feel like they're potentially shut out from accessing those services. And that's a lot of the work that the Black Legal Action Center does as well, is that we create a space where our community is able to access legal and community services where they might otherwise feel that they are not able to in other places because they've had negative experiences. So I really ask everybody here to really think about, if you do work in those kinds of organizations or environments, to really consider if part of the work that you do, maybe policies that are in place, maybe the environment, maybe lots of different aspects could be perpetuating anti-Black racism, and how that could be impacting your clients. Sade, I'm not sure if you are on, I think you're still on mute if you're saying something.
Sorry, I was muted again. I just actually wanted to add to what Sade was saying in terms of the impact. There are many people in the Black community whose trusts have been completely shaken in these higher institutions. And we're really seeing that play out right now in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine, for example. A lot of Black communities don't want to take the vaccine just because their trust has been shaken just from years and years of discrimination and unfair treatment. And that's really just a huge impact that actually can affect society. If, there's a whole community or several different communities in Canada who are refusing to trust in the vaccine, that can really affect. So there's a lot of impacts that come out of anti-Black racism. So we just want to think about, how can understanding anti-Black racism make you a more effective advocate, a better lawyer, a social worker, interpreter, counselor? So in terms of allyship, there's a quote here. So not being racist is not some default starting position. If you don't simply get to say you're not a racist, not being racist or ableist or a homophobe. is a constant, arduous process of learning, of being uncomfortable, of eating crow and being humbled and reevaluating. So another quote we have here is, people are so willing to do this performative allyship thing. We don't want your allyship at a protest if you're letting racism slide at the dinner table. Now, that actually leads into a very interesting discussion about transactional allyship versus conversational allyship. Now, the idea of transactional allyship is that you're showing support, you're checking off each box that's required. So you're putting out a statement for your organization. We're supporting BIPOC communities, but you're doing this in a sort of self-serving manner. Now, this is not really the right kind of allyship that these communities that we're looking for. So normally transactional allyship will come from someone who already has a privileged position, and it's really just self-serving to make them feel better about themselves. But what we really need to do, if you really want to take part in allyship and really, changing the world for a better place, you need to ask yourself, do these communities need help? Are they asking for help? This is where conversational allyship comes in. We want to get the conversation going. It's not just self-serving, but it's really, how can we make life better for these other communities? So it's really just listening. So listen to what people tell you, listening to what people in minorities are telling you, what they need. Are they asking for help? So yeah, these are very important things to think about. So when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. So being an ally is not an identity, it's a process. And I really love this quote here, because it's really not just, one or two things, or just, coming out and supporting something publicly or making a public statement. It's really a continual process of really deprogramming yourself from the institutional racism and discrimination that really is just prevalent in our system. Another thing I wanted to touch on is, if someone comes forward and claims they have experienced racism that you are perpetuating or that you have caused, it's not something to take personally. So the thing you can do is just apologize and then work to address it. So really just keep doing the work.
And in terms of methods of addressing anti-Black racism or systemic racism in general, one of the tools at our disposal is data. And so we really advocate for folks to be collecting race-based data within their organizations and within their work. So what collecting race-based data does is it provides us with, the evidence to understand what racial discrimination looks like, how it is really impacting the lived experiences of people. It could potentially be used to increase access to services and improve services. It really makes problems that we know exist become visible and have data to back it up, so that changes in policy and services and so on could really have the backing they need and the evidence they need to be able to do that. And it creates a clear link between what people are saying they're experiencing and how it's impacting them. So for example, if students, for example, are saying they experience racism in school, it really makes it clear what that does and the impact of that when you look at the statistics that we mentioned earlier of higher rates of suspensions, higher rates of expulsions as compared to their white peers. And it really makes it possible also to attribute responsibilities to, for example, in that situation, school boards, school administrations, and so on, in terms of what are they doing to be perpetuating that racism, and what will they be doing to address it in the future. And obviously, there are also risks in terms of focusing a lot on disaggregated data. It could be misused and misinterpreted. It could also lead to racial profiling and feed the stereotypes and prejudices that it is trying to, dismantle. So, for example, high rates of Black people in contact with the criminal justice system. That could be, when misused or misinterpreted, could look like Black people are more likely to be criminals, when in fact it should be looking like, why is it that a specific group of people is more likely to be arrested, more likely to be surveilled, more likely to have harsher punishments, and so on. And at the same time, we really have to make sure that when we are collecting this kind of data, or when we're centering these experiences, or when we're working, generally speaking, to combating anti-Black racism, especially in our work, especially with our clients, that we're not just extracting data, we're not extracting information from these groups. We're working alongside, we're listening, and we're not really, we're not perpetuating the same power dynamics that have led to these issues in the first place. And so for people who are service providers, advocates, lawyers, community workers, social workers, and so on, there is that power dynamic in place. And when one is trying to address issues, they could be falling into the trap of perpetuating that exact same power dynamic. So it's really critical that when one is approaching, different ways in the workplace, for example, of addressing systemic racism and making sure that, clients have the best services needed, they have access, and there are no barriers, that they're doing so in a way that is not perpetuating the same power dynamics and extracting information, and taking, an extra toll on their racialized clients.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to leave the thoughts just for a couple minutes at the end here. We have a couple more slides left. So we want to talk about how we can fight anti-Black racism in our work specifically. So when we're looking at manifestations of anti-Black racism within organizations, it's important to think about planning. So what is prioritized? So in terms of avoiding anti-Black racism, what is prioritized in terms of programs and work plans? Is it the programs that are specifically serving maybe like the white population are getting more priority over these other programs? What about budgeting? What items are prioritized? Sorry, what items are added? What are being removed? Personnel, who's being hired, who's being retained, promoted or developed as leaders, like who's getting more attention, who is getting more encouragement. Policy development, what do we propose or modify? So practices as well, so routines and habits. Should you continue them? Should you change them? Should you cut them? A few other ideas in terms of addressing anti-Black racism or the manifestation of it within your organization is to undergo anti-Black racism or hidden bias training, maybe from a consultancy firm, like racial sensitivity training. Maybe you can review current policies and procedures. As I mentioned, de-escalation training is another thing that can really help in terms of dealing with populations who are in crisis in terms of mental health. So if you consider in each of your departments, so how do Black clients currently experience your services? Are there any barriers? Are there opportunities for change? These are the kind of questions that you really need to focus on and really think deeply about in order to address anti-Black racism and how it manifests potentially within your organization.
And we also, want people to think deeply about this and consider, what would your organization look like with a strong commitment to addressing anti-Black racism?
So finally, we've got some takeaways here. So a lot of things that we've just discussed. So addressing anti-Black racism does not equal diversity and inclusion or multiculturalism. So it's a process that you have to continuously really think about. It's not just, you can't just address it one time and call it a day. So you have to really consider intersectionality, as we discussed. So center the leadership of Indigenous and Black people as well. Broaden how you think about racism. So focus on impact, not intent. So as Sade was saying, it's not whether you intended to be racist, but it's the impact that has had on the person that you have been racist to. And try not to take it so personally if it is pointed out that there was something racist that happened. So address internalized interpersonal and institutional racism. So collecting data is a huge one, and please just be reflective in the hiring process and in the promotions process as well. So it really does start from a place of understanding that there are many intersecting factors that have contributed to this situation of anti-Black racism. So just really validate experiences. If you're coming into contact with a person from the Black community, just validate their experiences. They have potentially been through a lot of trauma, so it's very difficult to relive these experiences. They also may have been impacted emotionally, as Sade was just saying. So just try to just really have empathy when you're talking to them. Just listen to what they're saying. So don't assume that you know what's best. Just listen to what they're telling you, listen to what they need. As this comes back to the conversational allyship, you really just need to cater to what they're telling you. So listen to them, don't be dismissive, and finally believe what they're saying. So just for the last thought here, whiteness does hold power. So someone might believe a white person over a Black person subconsciously. So a lot of this is subconsciously. So really just be mindful of that.
Yeah, thank you, Sade. Those are really great examples. There's a few comments in the chat I just wanted to address. So one person asked about equity and inclusiveness committees in workplaces. I don't have specific examples of what works well or what doesn't work well, but I will just reiterate again that point about making sure that, you know, for example, if you're doing this in the workplace, that your racialized coworkers and colleagues are not just being used for the purpose of this committee, and that nothing is really being you know, being changed. And so making sure that there's like accountability to make sure that changes are taking place in terms of ensuring that the workplace is inclusive and diverse, and that there's equity being practiced, and that the individuals who are contributing to that are being treated fairly, and the information and experiences not just being, you know, extracted from them in that way. And yeah, and someone else also mentioned the idea of being an ally versus an accomplice. I think, yeah, accomplice is a really great word to use as opposed to ally. A lot of the time, it's about really being in, you know, working alongside people and having a vested interest as well. And yeah, and someone also mentioned ensuring that hiring practices yeah, or addressing issues of systemic racism is really, really key. So thank you everybody for the comments, and thank you for listening today and joining us.
Thank you so much to Halda and Sade for presenting today. The presentation was extremely informative. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us. To the people that remain, if you could take a minute and just fill out the evaluation form, Dominica just posted it again in the chat box. It only takes about a minute, and it just helps us provide further informative lunch and learns in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everybody. Take care and have a good rest of your day.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.